On July 8, 1898, a man walked down a wooden wharf in Skagway, Alaska, carrying a Winchester rifle. His name was Jefferson Randolph Smith, but everyone called him Soapy. Behind him stood his gang, 50 men who controlled every saloon, every gambling hall, every street corner in town. In front of him stood 4 vigilantes who'd had enough. The confrontation lasted less than a minute. When it was over, Soapy Smith lay dead on the wharf, and the most elaborate criminal empire in frontier history died with him. This is the story of how a soap salesman became the uncrowned king of the Klondike Gold Rush, and how his reign ended exactly the way you'd expect, and yet nothing like you'd imagine. Jefferson Randolph Smith was born in Georgia in 1860 to a respectable family that lost everything in the Civil War. By the time he was a teenager, he was drifting through Texas working odd jobs, cowboy, bartender, anything that paid. He wasn't a gunfighter, he wasn't physically imposing, but he had something more valuable on the frontier, the ability to talk anyone into anything. In 1879, he landed in Denver and discovered his calling. The con was beautifully simple. Smith would set up on a busy street corner with a wooden box, a stack of soap bars, and a pile of dollar bills. He'd wrap the bills around several bars of soap, then cover them all in plain paper so you couldn't see which bars had money. Then he'd start his pitch. "Ladies and gentlemen, 5 cents gets you a bar of fine soap, but some of these bars, and I'm not telling which ones, have a dollar bill wrapped inside. Maybe even a 5 or a 10 or..." And here he'd hold up a $100 bill to gasps from the crowd. "Maybe even one of these." The crowd would press closer. Who wouldn't risk a nickel for a chance at $100? Then someone in the crowd, always a stranger, always enthusiastic, would buy a bar, unwrap it, and shout with joy, $100! I got $100! The crowd would surge forward, waving nickels. Smith would sell soap as fast as he could hand it out. When the box was empty, he'd pack up and disappear. The stranger who won the $100, one of Smith's associates planted in the crowd. The soap everyone else bought, just soap. The scheme worked so well that Smith ran it for nearly 20 years across the frontier. A Denver policeman once arrested him for the scam, and when writing the report, couldn't remember Smith's first name. He simply wrote Soapy in the police log. The nickname stuck. But soap was just the beginning. By the mid-1880s, Soapy Smith had assembled a criminal organization that controlled much of Denver's underworld. His gang ran rigged gambling operations, pickpocketing rings, and sure-thing investment schemes. They operated fake employment offices that charged desperate men fees for jobs that didn't exist. They sold shares in non-existent mining claims. The gang included some of the most skilled con men in the West. Texas Jack Vermillion, a gunfighter who'd ridden with Wyatt Earp. Big Ed Burns, a veteran bunco artist from Chicago Smith, organized them into a disciplined operation that moved through Denver like a well-oiled machine. What made Smith different from most frontier criminals was his presentation. He didn't look like a thug. He wore expensive suits. He spoke like an educated gentleman. He donated to charities and showed up at church on Sundays. He even ran a legitimate business, the Tivoli Club, one of Denver's most popular gambling halls and saloons. The Tivoli sat on the corner of Market and 17th Street, a substantial building that announced Smith's arrival as a power in the city. Above the entrance to the gambling rooms hung a sign in Latin, "Caveat emptor," let the buyer beware. Most customers couldn't read Latin. Inside, the Tivoli offered fine whiskey, live music, and card games. Most of the games were honest, but if you looked like you had money to lose, you might find yourself invited to a private game in the back room. Those games were never honest. Smith's operation worked because he understood something fundamental about human nature. People want to believe they're clever enough to beat the system. The soap scheme worked because customers convinced themselves they could identify which bar had the money. The rigged card games worked because players believed their skill would overcome bad luck. Smith also understood that local authorities could be managed. He made generous donations to Denver politicians. He provided security for political rallies. When reformers tried to shut down his operations, Smith's political friends intervened. For nearly a decade, Soapy Smith was one of the most powerful men in Denver. He threw lavish parties. He was photographed with governors and senators. He cultivated an image as a sportsman and a philanthropist. But Denver was changing. The city was growing more respectable. Reformers were gaining power. And in 1892, after one too many public scandals, the authorities finally cracked down. Smith's gambling operations were raided. Several of his associates were arrested. Soapy Smith needed a new territory. In 1892, silver was discovered in Creede, Colorado. Within months, the population exploded from 0 to 10,000. The town consisted of one muddy street lined with tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings. Soapy Smith arrived in Creede with his entire organization and immediately set up operations. Within weeks, he controlled most of the gambling in town. His associates ran the Orleans Club, one of the largest saloons. They operated shell games on street corners. They sold shares in worthless mining claims to newly arrived prospectors. Smith even opened a fake assay office where miners could have their ore samples tested. The office would consistently undervalue good ore, then offer to buy it at the low price. If the miner refused, Smith's associates would note where his claim was located, and claimed jumpers would show up soon after. He also brought McGinty to Creede. McGinty was a petrified man, supposedly a prehistoric human discovered in the Colorado mountains. Smith charged 10 cents admission to see the wonder. While customers waited in line, his shell game operators worked the crowd, winning dollars while the curious paid their dimes. McGinty was a hoax, nothing more than concrete poured over skeletal remains, but it drew crowds, and crowds meant opportunities. But Smith also understood that a successful con required community goodwill. He made public donations to build a church. He organized a volunteer fire department. When a local family lost their home in a fire, Smith held a fundraiser, never mind that his gambling operations had taken most of the father's money the week before. The Creede newspaper described Smith as a philanthropist and gambler. It wasn't necessarily a contradiction. He was genuinely generous with some of his ill-gotten gains. He just made sure everyone knew about it. Smith's reign in Creede lasted less than a year. The silver market collapsed in 1893 during the national financial panic. The mines closed. The population evaporated. Within months, Creede was nearly abandoned. Soapy Smith needed a new territory. And then, in 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike. The Klondike Gold Rush was the last and largest gold rush in American history. Between 1896 and 1899, an estimated 100,000 people headed to the Yukon Territory in Canada, hoping to strike it rich. But they all had to pass through Alaska first, and the main gateway was a tiny settlement called Skagway. In August 1897, Soapy Smith arrived in Skagway with several of his associates. The town had a population of about 500, but that number would swell to over 20,000 in the next year as stampeders arrived from Seattle and San Francisco. Most of these prospectors were amateurs. They'd saved up enough money for passage to Alaska and basic supplies. They'd never been to the frontier before. They had no idea how to navigate the dangerous trails to the Klondike, and they were carrying everything they owned in cash. For Smith, the opportunities were extraordinary. Within weeks, he'd established connections with corrupt officials. But it wasn't until March 1898 that he opened his main base of operations, Jeff Smith's Parlor, a saloon that became known as the Real City Hall. From there, his gang controlled most of the saloons and gambling halls. They operated telegraph offices, freight companies, and packing services that promised to help prospectors get their supplies over the mountains. All of these services were elaborate frauds. The telegraph office was particularly clever. Prospectors who wanted to send messages home would pay the fee and dictate their telegrams. The clerk would tap out something on the telegraph key, but the wire wasn't connected to anything. The messages never went anywhere. Telegraph lines wouldn't reach Skagway until 1901. When family members back in Seattle or San Francisco tried to send replies, the Skagway Telegraph Office would deliver them. But the replies were written by Smith's associates based on information the prospectors had already provided. The scam was nearly perfect. It generated fees, gathered intelligence on who had money, and created friends who would steer victims toward Smith's other operations. The packing services were simpler, but equally effective. A prospector would pay to have his supplies transported over White Pass to the Klondike. The supplies would disappear, sometimes sold to other prospectors, sometimes simply vanished into Smith's warehouses. The gambling operations were rigged. The saloons served watered-down whiskey at inflated prices. The brothels stole from drunk customers. And Smith's street gangs operated openly. His men would pose as friendly locals, offering to help new arrivals find honest businesses, then lead them to Smith's establishments. They'd pose as successful miners, showing off pouches of gold dust and telling stories about easy claims, then sell fake maps and worthless information. Some estimates suggest that Soapy Smith's organization fleeced over $1 million from Klondike stampeders in less than a year. That's roughly $30 million in today's money. But Smith wasn't content just running criminal operations. He wanted legitimacy, respectability, power. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Smith organized his own militia, the Skagway Military Company, with himself as captain. He wrote to President William McKinley and received official recognition on July 4, 1898, just 4 days before his death. Smith rode his gray horse at the head of Skagway's Independence Day parade. On the grandstand, he sat beside the territorial governor. In early 1898, a group of Skagway citizens formed a vigilance committee to deal with the crime problem. They called it the Committee of 101, 101 honest men who'd had enough. Smith's response was characteristically bold. He formed his own organization, a counter-committee claiming over 300 members. Some sources say 303, others 317. Regardless of the exact number, the name created confusion and gave Smith political cover. He even positioned himself as a civic leader. He organized 4th of July celebrations. He raised money for disaster relief after the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. He made sure the Skagway newspaper reported his charitable activities. But the situation was becoming untenable. The legitimate business owners in Skagway were losing patience. Prospectors who'd been robbed were spreading warnings. The Canadian authorities, who controlled the Klondike itself, were refusing to allow Smith or his known associates across the border. And then, on July 7, 1898, something happened that made it impossible for the honest citizens of Skagway to look the other way any longer. John Douglas Stewart was a prospector who'd just returned from the Klondike with nearly $2,700 in gold dust, roughly $80,000 today. He'd been lucky in the gold fields and was heading home to Seattle. On July 7th, Stewart was lured into a game of three-card Monte on a Skagway street corner. The game was run by one of Smith's associates. Within minutes, Stewart's gold dust was gone. Stewart went to the authorities, but Skagway didn't really have authorities, not in any meaningful sense. The U.S. Marshal was sympathetic, but explained that his jurisdiction was limited. The local police were mostly Smith's men. Word of the robbery spread quickly. The Committee of 101 met that evening and decided they'd had enough. They scheduled a meeting for the next evening, July 8th, at Juneau Wharf, to decide what to do about Soapy Smith. They heard about the meeting, and he decided to confront them. At about 9:15 p.m. on July 8th, Soapy Smith walked down the wooden planks of Juneau Wharf carrying his Winchester rifle he'd been drinking. Witnesses said he was in his cups, and he was angry. At the entrance to the wharf stood 4 guards: Frank Reed, the city engineer, Jesse Murphy, John Landers, and Captain Josias Tanner. Their job was to prevent anyone from entering the meeting who wasn't part of the Committee of 101. Reed was 54 years old, an Oregon native who'd worked as a bartender before becoming Skagway's surveyor. He'd laid out the town streets and sold lots to miners. He'd seen what Smith's operation was doing to Skagway, and he'd had enough. Smith demanded to be let through. Reed refused. What happened next was witnessed by several people, but accounts vary on the exact sequence of events. Smith raised his rifle. Reed drew his revolver. Someone shouted. Smith fired. The bullet grazed Reed's leg. Reed fired back, hitting Smith in the leg and the arm. Smith fired again, this time hitting Reed in the groin. Reed fired twice more. One bullet hit Smith in the chest, another hit him in the heart. Smith's last words were, "My God, don't shoot." Soapy Smith fell to the wooden planks and died almost instantly. He was 37 years old. Frank Reed survived long enough to be carried to a doctor's office, but his wounds were too severe. He died 12 days later, on July 20th, 1898. Some accounts suggest that another guard, Jesse Murphy, may have fired the fatal shot. A letter from Sam Steele, the legendary head of the Canadian Mounties, indicated Murphy's involvement, but history remembers it as Reed's fight. Within hours of Smith's death, the Committee of 101 moved to dismantle his criminal empire. They arrested dozens of his associates. Some were given trials. Of a sort, most were simply put on boats and expelled from Alaska with warnings never to return. The stolen gold dust was recovered and returned to John Stewart. The fake telegraph office was shut down. The rigged gambling operations were closed. Smith's body was initially buried in the Skagway Cemetery. His funeral was presided over by a local minister who chose Proverbs 13:15 as his text. The way of transgressors is hard. Few people attended. The man who'd claimed to be Skagway's leading citizen died unmourned by the community he'd terrorized for a year. Frank Reed, on the other hand, was given a hero's funeral thousands attended. A monument was erected over his grave with the inscription, "He gave his life for the honor of Skagway." In the decades since, historians have debated the showdown on Juneau Wharf. Some have questioned whether Reed really deserves the label hero. He was, after all, a surveyor who'd come to Alaska for economic opportunities, not law enforcement. Others have pointed out that vigilante justice, even against someone like Smith, sets a dangerous precedent. But in the context of 1898 Skagway, the shooting of Soapy Smith represented something important. The moment when an actual community asserted itself against organized crime. Soapy Smith's criminal career lasted less than 20 years. But in that time, he became one of the most successful con men in American history. He never shot anyone in cold blood. Unlike many frontier criminals, he never robbed a bank or held up a stagecoach. His weapons were words, psychology, and carefully constructed illusions. What made Smith remarkable wasn't just his criminal skill, it was his ambition. He didn't just want to steal from people, he wanted to control entire communities. He wanted political power, he wanted respectability. And for brief periods in Denver, Creede, and Skagway, he actually achieved it. His soap scam became so famous that it entered the English language. To this day, a soap job means a con where something worthless is presented as valuable. The term soapy became shorthand for smooth-talking grifters throughout the West. His criminal organization pioneered techniques that would be used for decades after. Front businesses, corrupt officials, elaborate confidence schemes, and public relations campaigns to create legitimacy. He understood that the best con men didn't just steal money, they stole trust. The Klondike Gold Rush produced hundreds of colorful characters, prospectors, dance hall queens, frontier lawmen, fortune seekers of every variety. But Soapy Smith stands out because he embodied something distinctly American, the belief that with enough charm, enough cunning, and enough audacity, you could reinvent yourself and control your own destiny. He just happened to use those qualities for crime rather than legitimate enterprise. Today, You can still visit Skagway and see reminders of Soapy Smith's reign. His saloon, Jeff Smith's Parlor, has been reconstructed as a tourist attraction. His grave remains in the Gold Rush Cemetery, marked with a simple wooden marker. And every summer, locals reenact the July 8th shootout for tourists. The Skagway Museum has artifacts from Smith's operations, rigged gambling equipment, fake gold samples used to lure investors, even the Winchester rifle he carried to his final confrontation. Frank Reed's grave sits on a hillside overlooking the town he died defending. The monument is far more elaborate than Smith's simple marker and far more visited. But here's the irony. Soapy Smith is remembered long after most honest citizens of Skagway have been forgotten. His name is known. His story is told, historians write books about him. Tourists ask about him. Frank Reed sacrificed his life for law and order. But Soapy Smith achieved a kind of immortality that Reed never could, because there's something about a clever criminal that captures the imagination in ways that everyday heroism rarely does. That's probably not the moral lesson anyone intended, but it's the truth. Soapy Smith, the con man who became king of Alaska, he lived by the grift and died by the gun, and his legacy endures longer than the gold rush that brought him to Skagway in the first place.